Welcome to this Conservative Home event in partnership with One Powerhouse Consortium. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and over the next hour, we're going to be discussing levelling up, regional inequalities, and what role pan-regional partnerships might play. So there's a lot of ground to cover here. Let me just very quickly run through what's going to happen. Each of our four speakers will speak individually. I'll introduce them briefly, one at a time. I'll then ask a few questions. It's then over to you, and I'll be taking them either from Zoom or through our own system, and we'll wrap up in an hour. So without any more ado, I'm delighted to welcome Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick. Welcome, Robert, and perhaps you'd like to speak to us about levelling up, regional inequalities, and pan-regional partnerships now. I think you should unmute.
Thanks, Paul. You would have thought 12 months on I would have learnt how to do that. But thank you very much for the invitation to be here this morning and to talk about this fundamental issue to us all. Those of us who were elected at the 2019 election were elected on a manifesto, at the heart of which was a commitment to level up all parts of the country, to bridge those regional divides, reduce inequalities, and ensure that everybody has the opportunity to get on in life. And to me, levelling up is essentially about life chances. There are many different aspects to it, and people place different weight on different things, whether it's productivity as a proxy for wages and prosperity, whether it's health inequalities, whether it's education and skills, whether it's access to culture, whether it's the quality of our built environment and our town and city centres, whether it's the broader environment and access to open spaces and the countryside. At the heart of each of these things is, can we ensure that all of our children and grandchildren can grow up in parts of the country where they have broadly even access to opportunities to excel and thrive in life? And COVID-19 has disrupted all of our lives, but in many respects it's changed very little. It's just magnified and amplified existing forces and trends that were present beforehand. It's magnified and amplified the decline of our high streets. It's placed more emphasis on good quality housing and access to open space. It's made us value communities even more and appreciate that some of them are under significant strain. It's shown disparities in income and opportunity for people, where some people on better incomes and in more secure jobs have had a relatively comfortable year, whilst others have had to remain in the workplace, had great challenges, even lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. So it's made us redouble our effort now as we start to come out of the pandemic to address these issues. And for me, at my department, which is a very broad one and at the heart of this agenda, the first thing that we want to do is think carefully about the places that we need to be working in. And we broadly defined this into three categories. There are our big cities like Manchester, London, Birmingham, Glasgow, Cardiff. And I do add in those cities outside of England purposefully, because levelling up is not just about England, it's the whole of the United Kingdom. And actually, as a result of the powers that we're taking for the first time since the late 1990s, my department and the rest of the United Kingdom government will be engaged in levelling up much more actively in all parts of the union, which I think is a very positive thing. But these cities, I think, have great fundamental strengths. They do underperform some of their US and European equivalents, but nonetheless, I have confidence they will bounce back. People will get back to work, to retail, to culture in those centres. There's more that we can do for some of those cities. A lot of it is about leadership, and where there are deficiencies in leadership, for example, we've seen some of the great failings in Liverpool played out in the last week. There, I think we do need to take action and support them. The second category at the other end of the scale are smaller towns. And there we're being very active. We're engaged through all of the funds that you'll be aware of, towns funds, high streets funds, levelling up funds, in working to promote and engage these communities and ensure that they can thrive. And there's an almost nihilistic debate at the moment about whether, led by the Labour Party, as to whether we should be investing more in Boston than Skegness or Stockport than Cheadle. But actually, We're now engaged in almost a quarter of the towns in England alone. And I hope by the end of this Parliament, we'll be working in half of the towns, clearly focused on those with the greatest needs, but giving them investment and opportunity that they haven't had access to hitherto. And then in the middle of this, we've got smaller cities and larger towns. I think this is in some respects the most challenging area. This is where I do want us to be very engaged. I'm working with Homes England now, our body, making sure that has a role in regeneration and trying to get private sector capital into these places. And I think government has a role here as well. And I was proud earlier in the year to announce that my department will be moving to Wolverhampton. The Chancellor is doing the same in Darlington, bringing government, bring pride, access to power to these smaller cities and communities, and ensuring that they have a greater role to play in our national economic and cultural and political life. So that's going to be a really important role in the years ahead. Lastly, because past is about pan-regional growth bodies, what is the role for that in providing leadership to communities? Well, I think there is an important role to play here for those over and above the councils and the mayors. I think here it is about trying to identify the big economic opportunities for areas, whether that's free ports, gigabit factories, major international investment, cultural events like the Commonwealth Games, and trying to ensure that these regions really secure those and thrive in the years ahead. I'm certainly doing that with the Midlands. Grant Shapps is trying to do exactly the same with the Northern Powerhouse. And there's going to be more for that, I think, in the months and years ahead. But that's all for me, and very much look forward to answering a few questions about these issues.
You two are on mute, Paul.
Paul, you're mute.
Sorry, that's two of us in a row who've done it. And I must introduce Saqib all over again. But I was saying, Saqib, you're MP for Meriden, having been elected in 2019. And you've been deeply embedded in this debate as you're the youngest ever president of the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce, director of the Greater Birmingham Solihull Local Enterprise Partnership. So you've seen all this at first hand. Now you're in Parliament, and please give us your views.
Thank you so much for that, Paul, and I really appreciate everything that ConHome is doing to around this debate and around devolution and levelling the country up. And of course, I would say this, but I genuinely mean this. I couldn't agree more with what the Secretary of State has said around levelling up. It is such an important discussion today. And actually, I was going to start by saying exactly what the Secretary of State said, which is COVID hasn't created new challenges. It's actually shone a spotlight on existing challenges. I could easily go back to roundtable meetings and conversations I was having in 2017 around the potential issues that may come from leaving the European Union. I remember I did a roundtable with Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands at the time, and there was a conversation going around skills gaps, productivity gaps, and even things like community cohesion. And I think what COVID has really done is shone a spotlight on this. And it's really intriguing because in my constituency of Meriden, for example, it really is a case of a tale of two halves. So we have a very diverse constituency, and actually, if you there is a statistic that I spoke about in my maiden speech, as long a time that feels like an age away now, but it was the fact that actually, if you travel from the most southern part of my constituency to the north, which is around an 8-mile journey, there is a tangible change in the life expectancy of people by about 10 years. And there's a lot of research to do that. So when it comes to levelling up, for me, this is very personal. You know, it's very much the reason I got into the job. It's very much the reason why I'm here, because if we, if we're ever going to change the environment for people and, move the dial, this is the time to do it. Obviously, there are. I talk about the challenges, and the dials are moving in favour of economic growth and sustainable long-term success. Actually, it's not to say these things aren't happening, and quite the opposite. I think there's been some great successes, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in the Q&A today as well. Not least the investments around infrastructure and skills and innovation. But it's also to start to think about how we start to adapt our kind of pan-regional organisations to be flexible enough to deal with the challenges of the future and focus on delivery. And you're right, I was a LEP director before the Midlands Engine came about, and involved in the Chambers of Commerce, and especially under the chairmanship of a relatively well-known individual called Andy Street, who I'm sure I'll mention a few times during today's event. But actually, I saw the birth of the Midlands Engine, and when I was asked to do this event, I thought, what are the key kind of ingredients, in my view, and that help a pan-regional organisation be successful? And there are, for me, two tangibles and two intangibles. And the first tangible is good data. And having effective components. And I'll just briefly go into those. And then the two intangibles are really accountability and identity. But if I look at the Midlands Engine, for example, this economy here, contributes about £234 billion to the UK economy, representing around 13% of the UK's output. We've got big names like Jaguar Land Rover, JCB, Worcester Bosch, Rolls-Royce, Siemens, and Bombardier, and highlighting the real tradition of manufacturing that is in our DNA. One intriguing stat is that we've got 92% of the UK's population is within 4 hours travelling distance of the Midlands Engine geography, which I think is really interesting. And it covers a regional element of about 11 million people. But the reason I give you those stats is to set context, but also to understand that actually why good data is important, because what it really means is it sounds like the most obvious thing in the world when we talk about it now, but actually having good data helps us to formulate good, effective policy. And the Midlands Engine invested in something called the Midlands Engine Economic Observatory, which had researchers, economists, constantly looking at how the Midlands Engine geography is evolving, how policies are working out, what's working and what's not working. And of course, it's almost like when I talk about it being obvious, not having it makes it sound like you're almost flying blind. And I'm a big fan of having good, effective data to help formulate policy. The second part of it is actually having effective components, because you can have the big, broad kind of pan-regional organizations, but you're only as strong as as the effectiveness of your individual components. So the Midlands Engine, for example, has the universities, has the combined authority, has the local enterprise partnerships. And if they're not working effectively, then you're going to go very fast in no particular direction, because everyone's going to be pulling everywhere else. And I think it's really important that you have components that understand where you're going. And we've had this recently with the UK Central Hub, which is the area around the HS2 interchange. And I won't bore you with the details, but a good collaboration which has the potential for creating 100,000 jobs and £5 billion worth of economic GVA. But really, it's about all the organisations coming together to unlock some of the most prime economic land in the country, in my opinion. And briefly, I'll just touch on the two intangibles, which is collective identity, because, of course, if you've got the components who work really well, you've got to have a collective vision. And one of the things I think the West Midlands and the Midlands has done really well is to kind of get its act together, really, from 2010 onwards, and understand what the vision is and understand what we stand for. The Secretary of State talked about Commonwealth Games and all the different kind of projects that are happening. Actually, it comes down to understanding who you are, where you've come from, where you're going, and have the ambition to achieve something greater than the individual parts. And I think that is it's that intangible that plays a really important role in building a fundamentally resilient and innovative economy. And finally, accountability. Of course, because if you can have all of those three components, it only works if the people who vote for you, who the people you are serving, feel that there is democratic accountability. And it's a challenge, and it's a journey, and it's something that you cannot get complacent on. But people have to feel that they've got a stake in the decision-making process, and that's really, really crucial for this to be effective. Because if you don't have that, actually, well, you can, for the average person on the street, they can almost feel that this is, all you've got is more layers of bureaucracy and some sort of highly complex quango, which always will lead to delays in decision making and not delays in delivering economic value and leveling up for the person who we're trying to serve. So I'm going to end it there. I thought that would be a good kind of setup for what I think is effective for pan-regional. But I will also commend MHCLG for that move to the West Midlands, because as I talk about accountability and identity, policymakers being closer to the people that they're trying to serve can only be a good thing, and it can only help to fundamentally nurture pan-regional collaboration. Thank you.
Saqib, thank you very much. And now for our third speaker, who's Piers Warburton, Chief Executive of the One Powerhouse Consortium, which is doing this event with us. And before joining One Powerhouse, he advised global infrastructure partners at the board of Gatwick Airport on the structure and implementation of their campaign for a second runway. So Piers, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much for putting together such an august panel. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about these issues. At the risk of appearing in violent agreement with everybody thus far, we are clearly all in violent agreement about the necessity for levelling up and how valuable and important it is to the human factor, the people who live in the Red Roofs or the Doncasters, wherever they are across the whole of the UK. Our focus has been on England. That is for several reasons. In the first instance, just a very brief word about where we've come from. We are a philanthropic organisation funded entirely by the Sir Hugh Sykes and Lady Ruby Sykes Foundation. Sir Hugh, as many of you may know, was the chairman of the Sheffield Regional Development Corporation in the 80s, which was widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best, of a mixed bunch. Now, clearly that paradigm has moved on, but Sir Hugh has been very keen to look at all possibilities, all practical possibilities for achieving levelling up. That is not just regional inequalities within England, but also stimulating economic development. And spatial planning is a discipline which has been very effective in the past, and in fact it is used by the home nations in London for their planning purposes at the moment. And so Hugh wanted to see how spatial planning might work for what we call the mega regions of England, that is the north, the southeast, which would include London, the Midlands and the southeast. There are some very powerful international examples where this has worked very successfully, particularly in Holland with the Randstad, in Germany with the Rhine-Ruhr, and most particularly in New York. The New York Regional Association brings together Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, and all the boroughs as well, into what is astonishing, given anybody's understanding of American politics, a voluntary organization to manage the macro issues such as infrastructure, housing, energy, and waste. So there are very powerful examples across advanced democracies and advanced economies that we can look towards. So we've gone ahead and we've joined with globally recognized practitioners such as, I'm very pleased to say, my colleague Andrew Jones with us from AECOM, Atkins and Barton Wilmore to create draft spatial plans for the mega regions of England. The real value begins to emerge once you see the graphics that they've produced, and I urge everybody to go onto our website and have a look at the various graphics and the various reports that we've produced. Fundamentally, this is about improving people's lives, and we have over the past 18 months been engaging with local authorities, mayors, LEPs, county councils to gauge their reaction, and I'm very pleased to say we get broadly speaking, a positive reaction. Now, if we were to look at one region, and this is, I suppose, the region that is most associated with levelling up, but there are levelling up issues, of course, right across the regions of England and indeed the home nations, and indeed London for that matter. The pan-regional partnership will only work if you have a rigorous discipline. And that's what we hope we are showing the way towards. So we have produced the spatial plan, or at least the draft spatial plan. Our suggestion is that the government commissions Sir John Armitt and his National Infrastructure Commission to take those plans to the next level. So to build upon the work we've already done, in tandem with locally representative groups, of which a pan-regional partnership would be a very obvious example. Now, in the north, you could quite easily have NP11, the Convention of the North, and Transport for the North. The Secretary of State, who I'm very glad to say is on our panel today, could encourage that process so that they would work with the National Infrastructure Commission to create the spatial plan for the North. And then in the other regions, we have the ME9, which Saqib has just mentioned. That is not quite as well developed as the Convention of the North, but it could easily be encouraged to become such an organisation that represents clearly all of that region. That, in turn, would be accountable to the centre through the Secretary of State. So I suppose how we're approaching this is we're not in any way disagreeing with the government. We actually agree virtually 100% with the recent Building Back Better. What we're suggesting is we have a mechanism that we know works and we think could work very successfully here in England. And as Saqib mentioned, I'm very keen to take any questions that come along in due course.
Piers, thank you very much. And finally, Andrew Jones, Cities Programme Lead Technical Partner at AECOM. Andrew's Chartered Town Planner and Urban Strategy Advisor, Board Director of AECOM, Head of City Programmes in UK, Europe, and Cities Executive for London. So, Andrew, welcome, and please give us your view.
Thank you, Paul. And I think, as Piers described, developing effective pan-regional partnerships should help the alignment of local and wider than local priorities for growth that just is missing at the moment from our toolkit. Aligning those issues of single authorities, even the larger unitary authorities or combined authorities, cannot really address these sort of broader issues, and the towns and the places that are larger towns and smaller cities that sit perhaps outside the combined authority, the metro mayor areas, I think, are the particular areas that are missing out in this debate, and where often a lot of the economic rationale and the drive and the economic drive that was there in the industrial period has not been effectively replaced, and this is a key target for levelling up, and we see that the pan-regional partnerships, and sitting there with behind them regional spatial plans to help cast the conversation and make effective decisions. I think one of the risks on this, we talked about levelling up, but actually we run the risk of missing carbon reduction targets, and some of the recent experiences of investments in infrastructure lagging behind the economic and housing growth potential that areas have. So this is a broad picture that goes beyond levelling up, but that I think shines the light on what we're looking at. So these larger scale spatial plans are absolutely built on data, evidence and analysis, and the kind of material that the observatories that Saqib mentioned slightly earlier, they drill into the heart of the issues and enable informed policy decisions. Now, AECOM is a multidisciplinary infrastructure, built environment consultancy. So our teams work in this space every day, and the interface between the built and natural environment, between economies and between housing. And the work that we've done that we've worked as technical partner with the One Powerhouse Consortium, but also worked for MHCLG and Homes England across the Oxford-Cambridge arc, absolutely drew on the socioeconomic data, including deprivation and prosperity, economic analysis of future locations for growth, housing delivery, housing needs, land availability and suitability, both in towns and rural areas, as well as environmental quality, agricultural value, drinking water scarcity versus surplus, risk of flooding on the other end of the water debate, and the availability of utility infrastructure and confirmed plans for upgrades, as well as transport modes and choices, all of which support sustainable, compact and resilient growth for the UK. Now, it's the layering of these elements cutting across a wider region and the multi-criteria analysis that comes out of that leads to that sustainable growth and regeneration potential, supporting existing communities and really flagging up where the challenges sit, as well as looking at where we can really maximise new economic sectors and their growth potential, and getting the housing, transport and jobs debates to align. So the solutions that start coming out of this work, and Piers mentioned a couple of examples internationally, that we really can recommend solutions which are more than local. They require authorities and other agencies to have common programs. They really streamline efforts and decision making. So I think there's a strong element of this work that helps to drive out the real challenges of levelling up. But as I suggested before, it goes beyond that. It enables transport investment to go hand in hand with housing and economic development. It enables utility providers to plan ahead to ensure that the supplies of power, water, broadband are in place to support economic growth. It means that we're not building in places that don't have and won't have sufficient drinking water, particularly as climate change and the effects of climate change cut in the drier parts of the UK. And also, I think there's also the regional spatial plans also frame decision making around valuable landscapes, rural areas where it hosts the best opportunities for environmental and biodiversity net gain, carbon sequestration, flood protection, etc., and that it's a common basis for making decisions about around how we can invest in the natural environment as well as the built environment. So I think that having the regional spatial plans prepared on common data and evidence means that that it frames the more than local and sub-regional statutory planning processes that are at the heart of our planning system, where local communities work those through, and also they give the cross-regional partnerships that we're talking about here the evidence to make sensible decisions. They go beyond being collaborative forums and help to frame the future policy. The Regional Planning Association that Piers drew out across the whole tri-state area, it's worth thinking about. That's 24 million people that the Regional Planning Association looks at. It's a voluntary organisation that came together nearly a century ago now. It's only prepared 4 plans in that time, but actually it recognises that planning at that large regional scale can deliver strategic goals. And it's amazing the constituencies that sit there with obviously elected members and officers and agencies, but also private utility companies, transit operators, academics, the voluntary sector and the private sector all come around to promote and work through the delivery of common priorities. So it's definitely worth a look at that, together with the other models that have been talked about through this morning. But there's a little bit of insight into what could sit behind the pan-regional partnerships, Paul.
Thank you all very much. Now we're going to have a bit of a discussion. I thought I might open it with a question about levelling up that very soon becomes a question about democracy and governance. And by way of introducing it, I'm going to read you a quote from a former cabinet minister who spoke to me about all this. And what he said about levelling up was this. He said, "We can't deliver levelling up, or a skills revolution, or an industrial strategy, or zero carbon from the centre. The new mayors have a convening power. They can get local businesses, chief constable, the NHS, bigwigs, university, vice chancellors, the LEPs round the table and come up with a plan. in his view, you need more mayors, including, I think, covering the rural areas, with more powers in order to deliver anything like levelling up, and presumably they talk and work with each other, and so you work up to your regional element in that way. So let me start with Piers. Piers, what's your reaction to that?
Well, again, violent agreement. I think what we are offering here is really quite simple. Everyone talks about levelling up, on the left, on the right, in the middle, in the media, locally, nationally. Everyone talks about levelling up, but there is no actual plan for levelling up, and that's the big difference. And I think that's what we hope is what we're bringing to this debate. The problems of the mega regions of England and the regions of England generally go back a very, very, very long way. And it's in some respects everybody's fault, and in some respects it's nobody's fault. It has just happened through actions of the left and through actions of the right. But we are, as they say, where we are. If we are going to get pan-regional partnerships going, it has to be around a mechanism. And that's where we stand. Our suggestion is that without a structure, without scaffolding, nothing will ever happen. And if you speak to Richard Leese, who does know a thing or two about realpolitik, I've heard him stand up several times now in front of his colleagues from the local authorities in the north, who historically have been difficult to deal with. I think that's fair to say, both with the centre, but equally with themselves. He said continually, if we don't come together over this issue, nothing will happen. And we hope that having something concrete that is tried and trusted elsewhere, that works in advanced democracies and advanced economies, that's got to be a great rallying point. And it's the rallying point that's been missing. I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Okay, Saqib, I want to try a variant of that question on you, which is this. I don't know very much about Meriden at all, but do your constituents, are they ever worried about, as it were, simply being sort of absorbed into what, in an ordinary year, ought to be really a kind of Labour authority, this West Midlands combined authority? Do they ever say, up in the north of your seat, really we identify more with Warwickshire, or in the south we're looking to Stratford? Do you get that at all? Because you're surrounded by constituencies to the north and south, and a bit east-west, that are not Birmingham, not Coventry, they're not big urban areas, they're quite rural.
It's a really good question, Paul. I think the general feeling is, if I speak to people, they will tell me that they very much feel part of the West Midlands. I think overall, probably, to answer that directly, they probably feel a great affinity to Birmingham, while also recognising their separate identity. And I think it comes back to when we talk about pan-regional organisations, and I talked about identity, of course, the great challenge is the vast geography, because the variety that you have, and trying to find a vision and an identity, or almost that kind of the strap line, that what defines you it's very, very difficult. And if I talk to, I was out earlier today speaking to constituents, and if you speak to them, if I say, oh, what does levelling up mean to you? I think that the real challenge is actually trying to define that. And I think the Prime Minister actually did this really well in the general election campaign, which was, there was this line that he used, which was that you have talent everywhere, but what we need is access to opportunity. And for me, that it's as simple as that. That when I'm talking about my constituents, that's where I want it to be. Now, but if I was an academic, or people, or an economist, they may well say, well, that's not, that's a good strap line, but where are the key data points, the KPIs? And I think that's where that bit about the components comes in really handy, because of course what we have in the combined authority region, for example, we have 3 local enterprise partnerships. We have the Coventry Warwickshire LEP, we have the Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP, and we have the Black Country local enterprise partnership. And what I saw in the run up to being selected and elected actually was this kind of shifting, because obviously with the WMCA, you had this new, more senior economic planning organisation, and so there was a need for the LEPs to find, I guess, a new purpose and a new understanding of where they sat in this whole kind of infrastructure. And that really meant that actually they had to understand what their people wanted, understanding the niche of their regions, and then also looking to deliver rather than just create the strategy, because effectively the strategy was coming from a much more a higher level, etc. And what really worked well in my view was having this collective strategic economic plan for the region, but then also having tailored strategic economic plans for the different LEP areas. So I think it's really for those components to understand where their communities are aligned to, understanding what those what are the niches, what are the advantages, and then effectively trying to look at, okay, how can we make this work for levelling up? And of course, what that really then leads to is, where do you put the housing? Where are the educational opportunities? What are the skills opportunities? Where are the economic, what industries can we help, nurture, or what investment we can attract? And really, hopefully that probably demonstrates how complex actually levelling up really then becomes. And that's why it's so important, as I said in my introduction, that you need all your organisations pointing in the same direction, because otherwise you'll go nowhere very fast.
Andrew, more mayors with more powers?
I think that's interesting, and leading on, answering your question, but leading on from Saqib's point there, and your question to him, is that we have a whole series of areas that are not covered by whether it's mayors or other sort of combining strategic authorities. It is those smaller towns, the medium-sized towns and small cities, larger towns and small cities, where a lot of the difficulties are, that are sitting outside the mayoral authorities at the moment, that don't come with an equal weight in the conversation. And I think that's quite an important piece. A lot of the economic drivers that are sit behind some of the larger towns is because of their relationship with the city that they're in the broader hinterland of. It's the commuting patterns, it's the spin out organisations that are there. They're not entities on their own. They're part of the agglomeration of economies of the broader city. So getting back to your question, whether it's mayors and elected in the way that we have them around our large cities and conurbations, or a simplified position of the sort of the democratic position, that actually everywhere's got to have an equal voice coming to the table, so that all local communities are given a voice at that, because some of those places that are sitting outside are the conurbations are taking the pressures of growth that are coming out of the cities, but aren't necessarily and haven't been necessarily benefiting from the benefits of coordinated housing strategy or coordinated infrastructure out into those places.
Secretary of State, it's been a turbulent year with COVID, which has pushed everything back. And there's been talk of this devolution white paper. I mean, for all I know, you're going to call it something else, for England for quite a long time. There have been reports from time to time. There's one in the local government chronicle last January, a long time ago, talking about a heavy splash of reorganisation, paving the way for more devolution deals and metro mayors. Where are we on the timetable of all this? And what's your sort of reflex answer to more mayors, more powers?
Well, we will publish a document later this year. Obviously, the focus in the last 12 months has been on the pandemic, but we will bring forward proposals. We have actually continued with mayoral devolution, despite everything else that's been going on. At the beginning of last year, we finally got the Sheffield devolution deal over the line, which has been a very long-running saw. We secured the Leeds and West Yorkshire deal, and the first mayor for that region will be elected in May. And there are other conversations in parts of the country like Hull and the East Riding, for example, where there seems to be some enthusiasm. And there is some local government reorganisation happening in North Yorkshire, in Cumbria and Somerset. At the moment, there are consultations that are coming to a close and decisions to be made in the coming months. So those will proceed, and we will bring together our thinking in the coming months. I'd be careful about being too doctrinaire about it. I think there was a time when a kind of set model was emerging for the whole country, which was that the district and borough councils were inefficient and so should be swept up into unitaries. And then above a unitary would sit a combined authority and an elected mayor. And then above that would sit a pan-regional growth body. And of course, that is very neat, but it probably doesn't reflect the world as it actually is. And although we are a relatively small country, we're quite a varied one as well. And I think as Conservatives, we probably need to take a more nuanced view of that and allow places where there is a very strong civic identity, like Manchester or the West Midlands, to have elected mayors if that suits them. But there will also be parts of the country where that sits quite ill with political traditions. I grew up in the West Midlands, in the rural parts of it in Shropshire, and the idea of having the elected mayor of Shropshire doesn't really feel as if it sits within the traditions of that part of the world. Where I now represent in the East Midlands, it might sit a bit more comfortably being on the edges of Nottinghamshire, but it's still not, the East Midlands isn't an identity in quite the same way the West Midlands. It's almost the part of the country that was left over when all the others were divided up. So I think as my view is that we should take a bit less of a doctrinaire stance and enable different things to happen in different parts of the country. But where we can find opportunities to do, as others have said already, to create a more strategic view, we must try and seize those, because it does add something quite significant. And you need to give those organisations, whether they are combined authorities or mayors, resources. You need to try to build up their bandwidth so they've got the experience and capacity to really drive their communities. And that varies very widely across the mayoral combined authorities today. And you do need to add accountability, as Saqib said. And again, that's quite varied across the country today. There are mayors where I would argue there isn't a great deal of accountability at all. And when things go well, they like to take credit for it. When things go badly, they come back to the Treasury and ask for billions of pounds to bail out transport projects or to criticise the role of central government. We are still in quite an immature stage of devolution, and that's not to criticise it, really. I think that's to be expected, because this is a relatively early project compared to other countries around the world. And I would also just say that you need to build up behind mayors as well. In some respects, a mayor is the cherry on the cake. The mayor of Greater Manchester, the success or failure of that is really dependent on decades of good working within Greater Manchester. People like Richard Leese, who's been mentioned, there's good quality civic leadership there. There are local authorities with a record of coming together. They work with the businesses, they work with the NHS. That's what we need to build up in all parts of the country. And whether you give the cherry on the top, if you like, of the mayor or not, isn't necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is trying to build good quality leadership in all parts of the country. And I think in some places, sadly, we have let that go as a country in our efforts to be centralised. And we need to encourage better quality people to go into local government and for local communities to come together in a more strategic way.
Thank you. That's a very interesting answer. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. But first of all, I want to take a question from someone else. Question from Catherine Bennett, who asks, as the chair of the Western Gateway Pan-Regional Partnership, I absolutely agree with what Robert and Sadiq said about collective identity. We renew partnership and now assimilating the vital data needed to help derive policy priorities. I would be interested in the panel's view on best practice in establishing priorities. Secretary of State.
Well, firstly, I'm very pleased that Catherine agreed, I think 2 years ago now, or just before the 2019 election, so 18 months ago, to step up and run the Pan-Regional Growth Body, which she leads, which is trying to cross the border between Wales and England and look at that economic geography that encompasses South Wales, Cardiff, Bristol, the west of England, into the successful business you see in Gloucestershire, the cyber community and so on. So a very interesting area with a lot of international investment opportunities. I think for me, the immediate things will be trying to bring together the different partners, as I've described. That, say, Manchester is a good example of having done that. It does take time, and you have to build confidence and build good working relationships. Trying to understand what the USP of the area really is, if there is one. How will you market this place on the international stage in a very competitive landscape? There are lots of parts of the world, I think, which do think in a more regional way than we do. So if you go to seek investment in the Gulf or in China or India, then I think a regional brand can be important, but you've got to define what that is, see what the investment opportunities really are. We're not always so good at doing that as a country. We often go without having a real book of business in the way that some other places have, so that there are true investment opportunities to speak to a sovereign wealth fund or big institutional investor about, and then follow up on them and make sure that they actually happen. And I think focusing on the big opportunity, what are the big strategic opportunities? With the Midlands Engine, I've tried to guide them away from whether Hereford should have an eastern or a western bypass to whether there should be a free port, whether we should have a big net zero community at Toton in the East Midlands. How do we get a gigabit factory for our area? I think trying to see what are the real game-changing economic opportunities and focus relentlessly on those, because that feels to me one of the things that a pan-regional growth body can do that even a really excellent mayor like Andy Street or Ben Houchem can't do alone, because these are on a regional or even national basis.
Saqib, best practice of establishing priorities.
Well, to be honest, it's very hard for me to add to anything the Secretary of State just said, actually. I mean, for me, of course, the data element is really important, as I said at the start, because frankly, you need to have a very good understanding of your community, right? And so I can give you a very simple example of this. When I was at the LEP, one of the key things I was really trying to drive home was, we had such a variety of communities in such a relatively, compared to where the Midlands Engine geography is, a relatively small geography. And yet there were new communities coming in all the time. And I was always trying to drive my officers to say, try and understand what the new communities are, what the challenges are that they're facing, and how we can start to support them. And, going back to that earlier statement of, levelling up is more important now than it's ever been. This is the time now to really understand actually what through data, understanding where the opportunities lie and how we can start to engage more communities. So when I mentioned community cohesion, really that's what I was trying to get at, which is actually make sure that everyone feels like they have a stake in this. But the other thing, and I love the bit about game-changing opportunities. I guess if someone asked me why I got into politics, it probably was that to identify those real opportunities. I feel we have such an opportunity to be ambitious right now. And we've come out of the European Union, and we're not obviously floating off to the Atlantic, but we have opportunities with countries all across the world. We have a chance to really think about who we are as a nation, where we want to go. Whether it's things like gaming or whether it's the creative sectors in the film industry, or maybe it is the gigabit factory and being a world leader on carbon neutral technologies, for example. There is a whole load of things that I think we as a nation can now put our hand to, and obviously defining the priorities through that lens, in my view, it will only lead to success. And the final thing I'll probably add is the role of the private sector is incredibly important in this, I think, because we can all, I, by the way, was a chartered accountant, so I like to say I'm still in my heart, I'm still a businessman, less of a politician. But the longer I do this job, that changes. But the truth of the matter is, actually, business people, large and small, by the way, are as close to the ground to understand where the opportunities are, to understand, we can come in and have a look at actually structures and say, actually, why are we not being more ambitious? Why are we only talking about, unlocking this part of a region and not the other part? And I think that's where the priority aspect really becomes really strong, when you have great and strong private sector involvement. And all the best organisations I've seen have been where there's been a very good balance between the private sector and the public sector. And so I'm a big advocate for that.
Andrew. Hello. Is Andrew? Yeah.
Fallen by the 2000 plague of mute. I think that point around the balancing of public and private sector that Saqib has just talked about is definitely a key element to draw out here, and particularly in the work that we've been doing, that actually bringing private sector investments to public sector projects and getting that balance right is really important in the overall decision making process. So I think that in terms of the broader picture, it helps a great deal.
Okay, Owen Piers.
I think that the priority, to directly answer the question, is focused effort. That's very, very important. I think we're all very much in agreement across the board here. I think we're looking specifically at our geography, which is the mega region geography. The problem, and this goes back to the previous question about mayors, I'm fundamentally 100% in favour of mayors. The models work very well in America. I think the rollout of mayors, with the caveats that the Secretary of State have put in, which I 100% agree with, this is a good thing. The human factor is there. Will it work for Staffordshire? Probably not. But will it work for the large urbanised regions? Certainly will. And in fact is. And I think the more the public get used to that, the better. The problem arises in the gaps. And that's where, our argument is it's levelling up, and we want to dissipate regional inequalities and within the regions themselves. But it's also about economic activity and stimulating activity. The highest function of government is to facilitate, not to just dole out money. That's not the function of government. So that's why things like HS3 or Northern Powerhouse Rail and HS2 are important, because they inextricably unlock activity. But it's the gaps. If you have strong mayors, so Manchester has a strong mayor, that's great. But what happens between the strong mayor in Manchester and the strong mayor in Leeds and the strong mayor in Sheffield? Well, that's precisely where Doncaster is. So by looking at the region as a whole, which is sustainably, it has some level of identity, North, Midlands, Southeast, Southwest, and looking at the Southwest, you have the pan regional Western Gateway can easily be fitted in to a Southwest regional spatial plan. There's no reason why that. So even cross-border issues can be solved in this way. So it's really focused effort is what I think we're trying to offer here. That's not really been tried particularly, certainly not in England, but it has worked very well for London and Scotland, of course. So that's what I think we feel about that.
Piers, can I just ask you this as a follow-up? I've read your document, not read it thoroughly, but I've read it, and I've listened to what you've got to say. And you've painted a highly kind of rational picture of 4 regions working together with everything joined up and very comprehensively planned. I'm going to say, listening to the Secretary of State's answer, I may be misrepresenting him, just seemed to me that what the Secretary of State seemed to me to be saying was, hang on a sec, let's not just impose a single template on everywhere, assuming that it'll work for everywhere. Let's not just rush in with mayors if an area doesn't want them. And what he seemed to me to be pointing towards was a much more sort of spontaneous, bottom-up, voluntarist kind of approach. Now, is that do you think it's a fair description of, well, I'll ask him in a minute, but do you think it's a fair description of what he was getting at? And does that really sit alongside your plan?
Well, yeah, and we're certainly not dirigiste. I mean, there's no suggestion here that we are forcing anybody to do anything. What we are suggesting is we need focused effort in this regard. And the best way to achieve focused effort is, we feel, through the discipline of spatial planning. Now, there is nothing new about spatial planning. We know that it's worked abroad in analogous democracies and economies. And we know that it's worked in the British Isles, because part of the devolution settlement for the home nations in London is through spatial planning. What we're suggesting simply is that if the government are really serious about addressing regional inequality, and I take Saqib's point about private and public partnerships, I think that's very, very important too. If we're to make this happen, we've got to have a plan, and we've got to have a rigorous process. Now, the rigorous process is, I stress, not dirigiste in any regard. This would be both bottom up and top down, because the spatial plan will be developed in cooperation with the locally representative groups. And that's why I use the example of the North, because the North simply has evolved a little bit faster than everybody else, as Saqib was mentioning. So you have, in very simple terms, but not, I think, fanciful terms, you have Sir John Armitt's National Infrastructure Commission, the NP11 Convention for the North, who all already work together, and Transport for the North. Now, that's a fully representative body working on what amounts to a fact-based process, an evidence-based process, which is completely apolitical. There is no politics involved here, and you then plan from that. So I think the Secretary of State and I agree, because no, mayors won't work for everywhere, and some political situations will work better than others. That's not what we're suggesting. What we're suggesting is, in some respects, a depoliticized process, or partially depoliticized process.
Andrew, was there anything in my line of questioning, or does it all marry up wonderfully well after all?
I think this point around places not having a single solution for everywhere is absolutely spot on. I mean, your question around more mayors, your question around a number of these let's call it the administrative or democratic solution that can be absolutely and should be flexible to be appropriate for the places that we're talking around. But this issue, I'll go back to my point earlier on about places not having a voice at the table. So whether you've got a mayor or whether you've got a non-mayoral authority that actually having that voice at the table, and also understanding everybody understanding the role that different places play in a region, and what benefits a smaller town outside a city can get from the agglomeration effect of being close to that city or being close to a free port, etc., etc. That these wider than local issues are just as important for places that don't have mayors as those who do. It also means that the places that have mayors understand their responsibility and their place in the wider setting, rather than just drawing a line around their boundary and thinking around things that are relevant to their combined authority. So I think that again, I think I'm agreeing with Piers and Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, was I sort of right in interpreting your approach as a bit of let 100 flowers bloom, let 1,000 thoughts be spoken? I suppose that's a bit Maoist. But you do seem to be very keen on bottom-up solutions.
Yes, I think that was a fair summary, actually, Paul. When I was a Treasury Minister, I think I took a more doctrinaire approach to this, where it was what is a simple solution that you could impose on the whole country that makes perfect sense on paper, but actually doesn't really work for the world as it is. And in this department, I think I have grown increasingly to adopt the approach that you've described, that we need to have solutions that work for different parts of the country, which can actually be locally popular, and which reflect identity, because place matters enormously, and that is at the heart of levelling up. We want to have a country where people can grow up somewhere that they love, not feel they have to move away, that there can be strong sense of regional identity and character. And we need to respect that in lots of different ways, but including in the way that we create structures for government. And so I think we want to have a more spontaneous approach than perhaps we embarked on during the sort of George Osborne era, where there was an exclusive focus on regional mayors. They will work for some parts of the country and should be strongly encouraged, but we need to think of other ways forward for those other parts of the country as well.
Saqib, the last word is with you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I think I'm very heartened by the Secretary of State's approach on this. I think flexibility matters, and recognition of different areas and what works for them is absolutely the right approach. The phrase I'd probably like to end on is functional economic geography, and I think that really probably ties up all the different strands of what's being spoken about. So identity and place, and where people basically almost linked to your earlier question, where the people of Meriden link themselves to. It matters where their children go to school, where they go to work, where they see their friends. And so functional economic geography, in my view, should be the driving factor when we think about pan-regional partnerships, because actually, when we talk about accountability and being relevant to people's lives, because of course, if these organisations aren't relevant, then you lose the accountability, you have the deficit. Those things don't no longer, effectively, people don't have a stake in those organisations. I think functional economic geography is probably a good way to go, or at least a good starting point, and then you can obviously start to work around the edges and identify the nuances.
Well, Saqib, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists, to Andrew and Piers, Saqib, to you, and especially to you, Secretary of State, for giving up an hour of your busy day during this spring forum. Thank you all very much, and we'll be back in half an hour with our next event, Dreaming of and Delivering Net Zero. Once again, to the panel and to all of you who've listened and watched in, thank you very much.